Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. If there's one thing your average liberal understands perfectly well, it's that there's safety in numbers. Don't go out alone. Bring 80 million people with you. It's safer that way. There is a reason, a fundamental reason, the Democrats are natural joiners and organizers and petition signers, and that their highest virtue is conformity. They know that as long as they're all wearing the same uniform, they'll probably be okay. This is why you'll see one person in Brookline or Bethesda raise a Ukrainian flag in the yard, and the very next day, everybody on the street will have one too. Suddenly, it's an entire neighborhood of foreign policy experts, all specializing in Eastern European border disputes. It's amazing. Just last year, these very same people were all eminent virologists, every one of them with passionate views on the details of pandemic management. This is, in other words, not a movement of rugged individuals. This is a party based on the idea of the group, the bureaucracy, the blob. It's the party of weak, fearful people who are huddled together for collective power. When the Democratic Party speaks, it is always with one voice, often in a North Korean accent. One thing the party often speaks about is gun control. No American has the right to own an effective firearm, a firearm that does what firearms are supposed to. They'll tell you this at length. Having a gun like that is just too much autonomy for you. If it continues, you may start to believe that you're a free citizen. And we can't allow that, and we won't. Joe Biden, for instance, makes this point regularly. Watch.
We're living in a country awash in weapons of war. I got it done once. I'm going to do it again. Eliminate assault weapons. It's time to ban these. It's time to ban these weapons. The right to bear arms is not an absolute right that dominates all others. You don't need an AR-15. I'm serious. Think about it. Ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines.
You don't need an RA-15 or whatever they call it. So that's the head of the Democratic Party speaking very clearly that the party's position on guns. If we don't control them, you can't have them. Every Democrat thinks this is part of the catechism. So you can imagine our surprise. The other day, we're driving through Cambridge in the old hybrid Subaru, adjusting our surgical masks to cover both nose and mouth, and listening, needless to say, to National Public Radio, the voice of menopausal liberalism. And as we're listening, we hear this. We're going to play it for you and see if you can understand our total shock.
Mass shootings targeting LGBTQ spaces and a rise in anti-trans rhetoric have inspired some queer people to take up arms. New Hampshire's public radio Todd Bookman joined a monthly gathering of a gun group that sees firearms as key to their own self-defense. And as you might imagine, this story does include the sound of gunfire.
On a recent Sunday morning, the parking lot of Pawtuckaway State Park in southeastern New Hampshire is filling up with hikers. There's also a different crew, packing up warm clothes and weapons.
Thank you all for coming to Rainbow Reload.
Your anti-trans rhetoric makes the trans community carry guns. Rainbow Reload! They're packing heat. They'll be appendix carrying in more ways than one. Watch out. Wait a second, we thought. This is NPR, National Public Radio, suddenly telling you that actually guns are good. They're valuable tools of self-defense, really against you. So there are times when guns are good, says NPR. And we thought, well, wait a second. We've been listening to NPR since, well, Click and Clack, the Tappet brothers, and we remember very clearly their position on guns. For example, quote, the U.S. has more guns than any other country in the world. This is the same NPR that, in between updates on the latest trans dinosaur emojis, we've been following those very carefully, routinely runs segments calling for more gun control, and not subtle ones, like the segment entitled, Many Gun Owners Support Gun Control, so why don't they speak out? Oh yeah, a lot of gun owners support gun control. Of course they do. And yet, here's that same National Public Radio, state media, controlled by the Biden administration, encouraging people to go to the gun store immediately. But not all people, just trans people. Guns are bad, except in the hands of trans people. Wow. Here's more.
Groups like Rainbow Reload exist around the country, often called Pink Pistol Clubs. It's a place for experts and the gun curious to practice and improve their shooting. But this goes beyond hobby. there's a practical goal here, to prepare and protect themselves.
If the world is dangerous, then you have to be dangerous back. And that very much has pushed me into where I am now.
Ooh, the gun curious. Well, you know, when NPR describes something as the fill-in-the-blank curious, then it's a good thing. Ooh, the pedophile curious. Now the gun curious. The world is dangerous. You have to be dangerous back. Now, is that a quote from an FBI indictment of the Proud Boys? No, it's from an NPR segment. At this point, it's hard to tell the difference. And the lip-smacking NPR reporters just say it without any sense of self-awareness at all. What is going on here? Well, you know what's going on here, is that NPR has decided that guns are bad, except when the enforcers of its ideology have guns. You can't have guns, but faithful servants of the Democratic Party can. And that makes sense because, like all totalitarians, they want a monopoly on force, right? So debate ends at that point. When one side has all the firearms, you don't have to argue. You say, well, you can't change your sex. Shut up, bigot! Bang, bang! What's interesting is this is not just one NPR segment. The social justice reporter from NPR station KNKX in Seattle, a reporter called Lily Anna Fowler, just reported on a fascinating story. It's the suicide of a self-described trans person called Ucy. In case you want to look it up, it's EUCY. Here's how that NPR reporter described the suicide of Ucy. Quote, spoke to Rachel, a friend of Ucy, the Ballard resident who died by suicide yesterday while being evicted by King County Sheriff's deputies. Rachel says her friend had tried to get help in paying rent, but exhausted all options. Well, that sounds awful. So here's a person who's fallen on hard times like so many Americans, is getting bounced out of her apartment and kills herself out of desperation. And anyone hearing or reading that dispatch from NPR reporter Lily Anna Fowler would feel pretty bad for the person who killed him or herself. Politics aside, completely. But it turns out NPR didn't tell the entire story. What NPR left out was that Ucy had shot a sheriff's deputy prior to killing himself. In fact, Ucy put that sheriff's deputy in the hospital where he remains tonight after undergoing emergency surgery. That wasn't of any interest whatsoever to NPR's social justice team. They just didn't care. What they wanted you to know was that Ucy was part of the trans community and Ucy died. And so Ucy's life matters much more than anyone's, including the cop he shot, and certainly more than yours. So what underlies all of this? It's not about trans rights, of course. Do you really think Joe Biden and his faithful vice president care about trans rights? Not one bit. About as much as they care about the daily suffering in Selma, Alabama. Not at all. Selma, Alabama is a desperate place. Poverty and violence define it. But they show up once a year to relive the civil rights movement, and then they leave. That's how much they care. And that's precisely how much they care about the trans community. The trans community, of course, is a vehicle for something else, and it's always the same thing, which is political power. And political power made possible by political violence. They want to be able to commit it, and they want you defenseless, so you can't fight back. A lot of people in this country want it, not just NPR listeners. When police were holding a press conference about the shooting, again, the shooting of a police officer by a trans-identifying individual called Ucy, activists heckled the police spokeswoman as the cop was in the hospital undergoing emergency surgery. Why? Because they said the spokeswoman misgendered the shooter. Watch this.
We've been led to believe that your 29-year-old man is actually a transgender person. Is there any truth to that?
I have no idea.
I actually knew the person. They are trans, and I ask that they don't be dead named. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so obviously this country has reached peak frivolity. The officer is in the hospital fighting for his life, but the debate is whether we're dead naming someone who shot him. So the people in that frame, and a lot of people actually who listen to NPR, care more about pronouns than human life. NPR would rather you didn't know any of this. We only know that this actually happened because reporters like Jason Rantz and Andy Ngo, one like NPR, don't take any money from taxpayers, were paying attention and knew the details. And by the way, Andy Ngo has run the numbers about these claims of violence and genocide against the trans community. And here's what he found, having done actual research into it. Quote, there is no genocide of trans people in the U.S. or anywhere in the West. In fact, there's been an explosion of trans-identifying people, which research suggests is a social contagion spread by social media fads and youth peer pressure. The few dozen trans people tragically killed in America each year are usually murdered by black men in the course of prostitution activities. So we believe that that is factually true. None of that ever gets mentioned, of course, least of all on national public radio. What does get mentioned? Well, the neo-Nazis, of course, they're the real threat. They're the ones targeting Rainbow Reload militia. Watch this.
One of the members, Sharon, recently transitioned.
And I went from concealed carry every once in a while when I was sort of feeling it to every single day, because reading the news, having a few experiences, realizing that I've gone from old cis male white upper middle class, really no real fears about anything, to there are people that just looking at me will want to hurt me.
There's that individual fear of what may happen simply existing in public. But for some, there's also a more organized and ominous threat, including a neo-Nazi group now active in New England that's targeted trans people.
The neo-Nazi group active in New England. The least right-wing region in America. Every state is blue. But there's a neo-Nazi group that's terrifying everybody. Look, just to be clear, we're not against people, American citizens, carrying firearms, having firearms. We support it, including trans people. It's fine. But what you're watching here is not the exercise of the Second Amendment. What you're watching here is political hysteria, fear, ginned up on purpose with maximum dishonesty in order to get people in a state of agitation, armed people in a state of agitation. Doesn't matter if they're trans or not, whatever that is. It's the same template always. Scare the crap out of your voters, tell them that their lives are at risk, encourage them to get guns. How do you think that ends? But by the way, if we're following the logic here, and why not? That's in short supply in this country. You have to kind of wonder, like, what's the limit to this? So if trans people are in fear for their lives in every region in the country, including New England, which apparently is crawling with Nazis now, why wouldn't we be arming them as we are, say, Ukraine's trans army? And there are famously trans people in Ukraine's army. They're very, very proud of that. So why stop with AR-15s? I mean, why not F-35s or tanks? You know, that's a question for our highest-ranking trans admiral, Richard Levine. Here is Richard Levine in July of 2020 describing the threat.
The most vulnerable among us continue to suffer, including LGBTQ individuals of color, LGBTQ youth, LGBTQ seniors, and LGBTQ immigrants.
So none of that is factually true, as we just told you. In fact, some of the people he's describing are not the most oppressed in our society, but literally and measurably the most entitled and privileged. The Biden administration hired a kid to oversee nuclear waste disposal whose only qualification was his sexual fetishes. So no, there's not genocide going on. There's some weird affirmative action program going on. But if you listen to NPR, you wouldn't know that. And that kind of talk might scare the heck out of you. And if they encourage you to go get a gun and arm yourself because Nazis are taking over Vermont, you might do it. Again, we're as for guns as you could possibly be. But this seems like an incitement. Subscribe to the Fox News YouTube channel to catch our nightly opens, stories that are changing the world and changing your life. From Tucker Carlson Tonight.